Picture this. December 1823. Somewhere in what we now call the Wind River Range of Wyoming. The snow is 8 feet deep, not the fluffy stuff you see in Christmas movies, but the kind of snow that becomes a living, breathing predator. Dense, heavy, the kind that can crush a cabin roof or bury a horse standing up. And crawling through this frozen hell on his hands and knees is a man named Jedediah Wilkins. His fever is spiking at what we'd probably call 104 degrees today. His fingertips are turning that telltale white of frostbite. Behind him, scattered like expensive breadcrumbs in the snow, lie $2,000 worth of traditional beaver traps. In 1823 money, folks, that's like abandoning a new car today. But here's the thing that's going to change everything. As Wilkins crawls through that powder, delirious and dying, his fevered brain starts seeing something impossible. He sees traps floating, not sinking into the snow like lead weights, but floating on top like winter birds riding the thermals. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, to understand why this moment matters, you need to grasp just how catastrophic the trap loss problem had become by 1823. We're talking about an industry that was literally drowning in its own success. The Rocky Mountain fur trade wasn't just some romantic adventure story. It was the economic engine driving American expansion westward. But here's the brutal math. Trappers were losing 60% of their equipment to deep snow conditions every winter. 60%. Imagine if your local McDonald's lost 60% of its equipment every winter and had to start over from scratch each spring. The economics don't work. The fur companies were hemorrhaging money, and the independent trappers, the mountain men we romanticize today, were going broke faster than they could skin a beaver. Think about what a beaver trap weighs. These weren't delicate little mouse traps. We're talking about 7 to 10 pounds of hand-forged iron, spring steel jaws that could snap a man's wrist, chain links thick as your thumb. When you drop one of these monsters into 8 feet of powder snow, it disappears like a stone thrown into a lake. And finding it again? You might as well be looking for a specific snowflake. But the trappers had developed this almost religious devotion to their routines. Every morning before dawn, they'd make their trap runs, check each set, reset the springs, move locations based on beaver sign. In the evenings, they'd gather around fires that seemed impossibly small against the mountain darkness, sharing stories and techniques passed down from the French voyageurs and Native American hunters who'd pioneered these methods. These weren't just tools to them, they were lifelines. A trapper's success, his very survival, depended on maintaining dozens of trap sets across miles of wilderness. Lose your traps, and you might as well start walking back to civilization, if you could find it. And here was the cruel irony. The best beaver habitat was often in the high country, above 8,000 feet, where the snow accumulated in drifts that would make a modern skier weep with joy. The beavers were up there because that's where the pristine water ran, where the aspen groves grew thick and sweet. But every winter, the mountains would swallow the trappers' equipment whole. Enter Jedediah Wilkins, though nobody would have picked him as the guy to solve this puzzle. He wasn't born to the mountains like some of these legendary figures. No romantic origin story here. Wilkins had been a blacksmith back in Ohio, and not a particularly successful one. His horseshoes cracked, his plowshares bent. The local farmers started taking their business elsewhere, whispering that Jedediah's hands weren't quite right for the forge. So, in 1821, at the ripe old age of 24, Wilkins did what thousands of other failed dreamers were doing. He headed west, bought himself a basic trapping kit, learned the trade from a grizzled French-Canadian named Baptiste, and discovered he had a natural feel for reading beaver sign. Where other men saw random stick piles, Wilkins could read the story of a beaver family's daily routine like a book. But he also brought something different to the mountains, that blacksmith's eye for how metal behaved under stress. While other trappers cursed the snow for swallowing their gear, Wilkins found himself studying the physics of it. Why did some objects sink while others seemed to ride the surface? What was the relationship between weight, surface area, and the snow's density? These weren't questions that typically kept mountain men awake at night. Most of them were practical souls who dealt with problems by applying more force or more whiskey. But Wilkins had spent years watching iron bend and break under pressure that seemed manageable. He'd learned to think about stress and distribution, about how materials responded to forces they weren't designed to handle. And now, crawling through that killing snow in December 1823, his fever-addled brain was making connections that his conscious mind might never have reached. The traps weren't just heavy, they were designed wrong for these conditions. Built for water and mud, not for snow that could shift and settle and compress under its own weight. As his fellow trappers dragged his half-frozen body back to their winter camp, Wilkins kept mumbling about floating traps. His companions figured it was just fever talk. After all, everybody knew that iron sank. It was one of those fundamental truths, like water running downhill or the sun rising in the east. But sometimes, the most revolutionary ideas come from minds that are too sick or desperate to accept fundamental truths. Sometimes progress requires someone crazy enough to imagine iron floating like a bird on the winter wind. And as Wilkins drifted in and out of consciousness over the next 3 days, fighting off pneumonia and frostbite, those fever dreams kept coming back. Traps that danced on the snow's surface. Gear that worked with the mountain's moods, instead of fighting them. A whole new way of thinking about how humans could adapt to this unforgiving landscape. What he couldn't know, lying there in that drafty cabin, was that his fevered visions were about to transform not just trapping, but the entire character of the American frontier. By February 1824, Wilkins had recovered enough to walk, but something fundamental had changed in him. His fellow trappers noticed it first in the way he looked at snow, not with the resigned hatred of men who'd been beaten by winter, but with the curious intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The other mountain men figured he'd lost his nerve. After all, he'd nearly died out there, and plenty of good trappers had been broken by lesser ordeals. When spring came and the brigade prepared to move to new territories, Wilkins made an announcement that stunned everyone. He wasn't going with them. He was heading north, alone, to spend the next winter with a band of Shoshone who'd been trading occasionally with the white trappers. Marcus Ironhand Fitzgerald, a veteran trapper who'd earned his nickname after a grizzly bear had mangled his left hand down to mostly scar tissue and stubbornness, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "You've lost your mind, Jed," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. "White man doesn't winter with the Indians, not unless he's planning on going native permanent-like." But Wilkins had been thinking about something one of the Shoshone traders had mentioned the previous fall. The man had watched the white trappers, struggling with their heavy equipment, and made what seemed like an offhand comment. "You fight the snow like enemy. Snow is not enemy. Snow is, how you say, dance partner." The idea had been rattling around in Wilkins' head for months. What if the fundamental problem wasn't the snow at all? What if it was the trappers' approach to working with it? So, in October 1824, Jedediah Wilkins walked into a Shoshone winter camp carrying nothing but his basic supplies and a head full of questions. The band's leader, a weathered man called Running Elk, agreed to let him stay, though Wilkins suspected it was more out of curiosity than hospitality. After all, how often did a white trapper voluntarily sign up for a winter of eating pine bark soup and sleeping in hide lodges? What Wilkins discovered over the next 5 months changed everything he thought he knew about survival in the mountains. The Shoshone didn't fight winter, they danced with it. Their snowshoes didn't just keep them from sinking. They were designed to read the snow's moods, to work with different densities and conditions. Their hunting techniques adapted to how prey moved through deep powder. Everything they did was about partnership, not conquest. But it was an old woman named Gentle Fox who first understood what Wilkins was really after. She'd been watching him study the way different objects behaved on the snow's surface, how a piece of bark could support surprising weight, how certain shapes seemed to ride the powder instead of cutting through it. "You want to make iron float," she said one evening, speaking in the careful English she'd learned from decades of trading with white men. "Is that possible?" Wilkins asked. Her laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Everything floats if you understand what holds it up." And so began the most intensive engineering education of Wilkins's life, though no university would have recognized it as such. Gentle Fox taught him to select willow branches by their flexibility and grain pattern. Not just any willow would do, but specific varieties that grew in particular soil conditions. She showed him how sinew could be prepared to maintain strength in extreme cold, how to weave it in patterns that distributed stress across entire structures rather than focusing it on single points. The mathematical principles she taught him weren't written down in any textbook, but they were sophisticated beyond anything Wilkins had encountered. Surface area to weight ratios, stress distribution across irregular surfaces, the physics of how snow compressed and shifted under different temperature conditions. Working by firelight through the endless mountain winter, Wilkins began building his first floating trap prototype. The basic iron components remained the same. You still needed spring steel strong enough to hold a beaver, but everything else was reimagined. Picture a traditional beaver trap, and you're thinking of something that looks like a steel bear trap with a chain. Heavy, solid, designed to sink to the bottom of a stream and stay there. Now imagine that same trap mounted on what looked like an oversized snowshoe made of carefully selected willow and sinew. The frame spread the weight across a surface area 5 times larger than the trap itself. But here's where Gentle Fox's wisdom really showed. The frame wasn't just about flotation. It was designed to read the snow's condition and adjust accordingly. In fresh powder, the wide surface kept everything on top. As the snow compressed and settled, the frame's flexible construction allowed it to adapt, maintaining just enough buoyancy to stay workable. The sinew webbing wasn't random either. Gentle Fox had taught Wilkins to weave it in patterns that created what we'd now call suspension points, places where the trap's weight was distributed across multiple stress lines, instead of concentrated on single threads. If one strand broke, the others could compensate. By March 1825, Wilkins had built 3 working prototypes. They looked bizarre, like someone had crossed a beaver trap with a spider web, but they worked, more than worked. They floated on snow that would have swallowed traditional traps without a trace. Word of Wilkins' winter project had somehow reached the other trappers, and not everyone was pleased. Marcus Iron Hand Fitzgerald had spent the winter spreading rumors that Wilkins had lost his mind, maybe been cursed by Indian magic, definitely couldn't be trusted with serious trapping business. When Wilkins returned to the White Trappers' spring rendezvous, Fitzgerald was waiting with what amounted to a public challenge. He'd set up a demonstration area where 8 feet of snow had been artificially packed and compressed conditions similar to what had nearly killed Wilkins 2 years earlier. "You want to prove your floating traps work, Jed?" Fitzgerald announced to the gathered crowd of 50 or so mountain men. "Let's see them float." It was a setup, and everyone knew it. Fitzgerald had sabotaged at least 2 of Wilkins' earlier prototypes, burning one and spreading rumors that the others were cursed by Indian spirits. He'd convinced a dozen traditional trappers that Wilkins' innovations threatened their way of life, their hard-earned expertise, their very identity as mountain men. But Wilkins had learned something important during his winter with the Shoshone. The best way to handle resistance wasn't to fight it directly, but to let your work speak for itself. He placed his floating trap on the packed snow surface. The crowd watched as it settled slightly but held firm, riding the snow like a boat on still water. Then he placed a traditional trap beside it. Within seconds, the conventional trap had punched through the surface and disappeared into the powder below. The silence that followed was the sound of an entire industry realizing it was about to change, forever. And then, Wilkins made the decision that would ensure his legacy. Instead of trying to patent his design or keep it secret for competitive advantage, he announced that anyone who wanted to learn the technique was welcome to spend time with him and Gentle Fox. The knowledge belonged to the mountains, he said, not to any individual trapper. Iron Hand Fitzgerald's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized his sabotage campaign had just made him look like a fool in front of every serious trapper in the territory. But bigger changes were coming, and none of them could have predicted what Wilkins's generosity was about to unleash. What happened next wasn't gradual change. It was revolution at the speed of wildfire spreading through dry timber. By the fall of 1825, word of Wilkins' floating traps had reached every major fur trading post from Street Louis to the Pacific Northwest. But it wasn't just word that was spreading, it was the trappers themselves, carrying their newly constructed floating rigs and stories that sounded too good to be true. Young Thomas Bridger, who'd later become one of the most famous mountain men in American history, was among the first converts. At 19 years old, Bridger had been struggling to establish himself in a profession dominated by grizzled veterans who measured success in decades, not seasons. Traditional trappers looked at his youth and predicted he'd be bare food or broke within 2 years. But Bridger understood something the old-timers didn't. This wasn't just about new equipment. This was about access to territory that had been essentially off-limits to sustained trapping. Those high alpine meadows, the pristine beaver colonies above 10,000 feet elevation, suddenly they were reachable, workable, profitable. Bridger's first season using floating traps yielded what would have been considered impossible numbers. Where traditional trappers might successfully work 20 to 30 trap sites in heavy snow conditions, Bridger was maintaining over 80 active sets. His take for the season exceeded what most experienced trappers accumulated in 3 years. The mathematics of success were becoming undeniable, and the mountain men community started paying attention when someone demonstrated a 300% increase in productivity. This wasn't theory anymore, this was money. But perhaps the most surprising adoption came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican-born woman whose husband had died in a grisly attack the previous spring. Conventional wisdom said widows didn't become trappers, they remarried or returned to civilization. But Gonzalez had 3 children to feed, and no intention of leaving the mountains that had become her home. She sought out Wilkins in the summer of 1826, becoming the first woman to master the floating trap construction techniques. By winter, she was outproducing men with twice her experience, and her success opened doors for other women who'd previously been excluded from the fur trade's economic opportunities. The transformation was spreading beyond individual trappers to entire organizations. The Hudson's Bay Company, that massive British enterprise that had dominated North American fur trading for over a century, initially dismissed the floating trap phenomenon as an American curiosity. Their representatives wrote condescending reports about primitive modifications that couldn't possibly compete with established British methods. That attitude lasted exactly 1 trading season. When Hudson's Bay Company trappers found themselves consistently outperformed by Americans using floating designs, corporate policy changed overnight. By 1828, the company was sending their most experienced trappers south, specifically to learn Wilkins' techniques. Within 2 years, floating traps had become standard equipment across their entire North American operation. The economic revolution was staggering. Territories that had been marginally profitable suddenly became gold mines. The high country, those pristine watersheds above timberline, was now accessible for sustained commercial exploitation. Trapping operations expanded into areas where snow conditions had previously made work impossible. But this success was creating problems nobody had anticipated. The traditional beaver population had evolved over thousands of years in balance with natural predation and seasonal hunting by Native American tribes. Suddenly, that balance was shattered. Floating traps allowed trappers to work beaver colonies year-round, in conditions where the animals had no evolutionary adaptations for avoiding human predation. By 1830, reports were coming in from across the Rocky Mountains about beaver populations crashing. Streams that had supported dozens of active lodges were down to 2 or 3. Some watersheds showed no beaver sign at all. Wilkins himself was horrified. His innovation had been designed to solve a specific technical problem: how to maintain trap sets in deep snow. He'd never imagined it would become a tool for ecological devastation on this scale. The legendary Trappers' Convention of 1831 brought together over 500 mountain men at a massive rendezvous near what's now Jackson Hole, Wyoming. What started as a celebration of floating trap technology became something closer to a crisis conference. Beaver pelts, which had been selling for $6 each in 1825, had dropped to less than $2 by 1831. The market was flooded with furs from previously inaccessible territories, and the animals themselves were becoming scarce enough that even floating traps couldn't find them. Some trappers were already pivoting to buffalo hunting and other pursuits. Others were heading further west, chasing rumors of untapped beaver colonies in Oregon Territory. But a growing number were beginning to question whether their profession had a sustainable future. The social transformation was equally dramatic. The traditional brigade system, large groups of trappers working together under company leadership, was breaking down. Floating traps had made individual operation more profitable than group efforts, and the mountains were filling with independent operators who owed allegiance to no company or collective organization. This shift changed the entire character of the American frontier. Instead of organized expeditions pushing westward in coordinated waves, you had hundreds of individual entrepreneurs scattered across thousands of square miles of wilderness, each following their own economic incentives and survival strategies. The environmental consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Streams that had been dammed and managed by beaver colonies for millennia were now running wild, causing erosion and habitat destruction that affected entire ecosystems. The indigenous peoples who had sustained themselves partially through traditional beaver hunting found their food sources disappearing. Some Native American leaders tried to establish treaties limiting trapping in critical watersheds, but the individual nature of the new trapping economy made enforcement nearly impossible. There was no central authority to negotiate with just hundreds of independent operators, each trying to maximize their take before the resource disappeared entirely. By 1835, the writing was on the wall. The great Rocky Mountain beaver boom was ending, not because the technology had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. Wilkins' floating traps had made possible a level of exploitation that the environment simply couldn't sustain. The man himself had retreated to a small cabin near present-day Dubois, Wyoming, where he spent increasingly long periods in what contemporary accounts described as melancholy reflection. Visitors reported finding him staring at empty streams where beaver lodges had once dotted the landscape like tiny islands. The price collapse of 1837 finished what ecological devastation had started. Beaver pelts became nearly worthless, and the era of the mountain man was effectively over. But the techniques and attitudes that floating traps had fostered individual enterprise, technological innovation, adaptation to extreme environments, those would shape the American West for generations to come. And in his remote cabin, Jedediah Wilkins was beginning to understand that innovation always comes with a price, and that price isn't always paid by the innovator. Jedediah Wilkins died on a bitter February morning in 1841, alone in his cabin except for a half-written journal that would remain hidden for the next 146 years. His final entries revealed a man wrestling with the monster he'd accidentally unleashed upon the mountains he loved. "I sought to dance with winter," he wrote in shaking handwriting, "but taught men to rape the streams instead. May God forgive what my cleverness hath wrought, and may future generations learn to trap wisdom rather than fur." The local trappers who found his body also discovered something unexpected: detailed drawings and specifications for what he called merciful traps, designs that would capture animals alive and unharmed. His final innovation had been driven not by profit, but by guilt over the devastation his earlier work had enabled. But by 1841, the damage was done. The great beaver colonies of the Rocky Mountains were broken, and the Mountain Man era was ending not in glory, but in ecological collapse and economic ruin. Marcus Iron Hand Fitzgerald, Wilkins' old nemesis, had died 3 years earlier, not in some dramatic confrontation with a grizzly or hostile Indians, but from liver failure brought on by cheap whiskey and despair over his obsolete profession. What nobody could have predicted was how Wilkins' floating trap principles would eventually find new life in places and applications that would have astounded their creator. The first unexpected resurrection came in 1857, when a British Arctic expedition led by Captain Francis McClintock adopted modified versions of floating trap designs for use in the search for the lost Franklin expedition. The principles that had kept beaver traps accessible in Rocky Mountain powder proved equally valuable for maintaining supply caches and equipment in the shifting ice of the Arctic Ocean. McClintock's expedition reports, published in London scientific journals, brought Wilkins' techniques to the attention of European researchers, who began applying the weight distribution and surface area principles to everything from snow bridges to mountaineering equipment. The floating trap had evolved into fundamental engineering concepts that influenced architecture, transportation, and exploration technology. But the most significant rediscovery came in 1987, when a team of historians and archaeologists working near Dubois, Wyoming, found Wilkins's cabin and his hidden journal. Dr. Sarah Whitehawk, a Shoshone historian whose great-great-grandmother had known Gentle Fox, was among the first to read Wilkins's complete writings. What she found astonished everyone involved in the discovery. Wilkins hadn't just documented his trap designs, he'd developed what amounted to a complete philosophy of sustainable technology. His later writings showed an understanding of ecological balance that wouldn't become mainstream scientific thinking for another century. "The mountain teaches patience to those who listen," Wilkins had written. "But we have trained ourselves to hear only the song of immediate profit. The beaver knew how to build dams that lasted centuries. We built traps that destroyed watersheds in decades. Which of us understood engineering?" Dr. Whitehawk recognized something that the earlier historians had missed. Wilkins' descriptions of sustainable trapping techniques weren't original innovations. They were careful documentations of traditional Shoshone practices that Gentle Fox had been trying to teach him during that transformative winter of 1824. The floating trap itself, she realized, had been a rediscovery of ancient principles that indigenous peoples had been using for generations, not for trapping, but for everything from snowshoe design to the construction of seasonal shelters that could adapt to changing environmental conditions. This revelation sparked a complete re-evaluation of Wilkins' legacy. Modern conservation biologists began studying his merciful trap designs, finding applications for wildlife research that required capturing animals for study without harm. The weight distribution principles proved valuable for designing equipment that could function in sensitive ecosystems without causing environmental damage. Contemporary indigenous trappers, particularly in Alaska and northern Canada, recognized Wilkins' later work as an attempt to bridge traditional ecological wisdom with industrial technology. Some modern Native American communities have adopted modified versions of his humane trap designs for subsistence hunting that maintains ecological balance. The floating trap principles have found unexpected applications in modern conservation work. Researchers studying beaver population recovery in Yellowstone National Park use equipment based on Wilkins' designs to monitor dam construction and colony health without disturbing the animals' natural behaviors. Even more remarkably, the mathematical principles that Gentle Fox taught Wilkins, those stress distribution patterns and surface area calculations, have influenced modern sustainable architecture. Green building designers use similar concepts to create structures that work with natural forces rather than fighting them. But perhaps the most poignant application comes from climate change researchers working in the Arctic. As traditional ice patterns become unpredictable, scientists monitoring polar bear populations and sea ice conditions rely on equipment that uses Wilkins' floating principles to maintain research stations on increasingly unstable frozen surfaces. The irony isn't lost on anyone familiar with the story. The same techniques that once enabled devastating overexploitation of natural resources are now being used to study and protect what remains of those same ecosystems. Modern trap manufacturers still use variations of Wilkins' designs, but now they're primarily serving wildlife rehabilitation centers, university research programs, and conservation organizations. The floating principle that once helped decimate beaver populations is now helping scientists understand how to restore them. There's a memorial to Jedediah Wilkins near his old cabin site, now not a grand monument, but a simple stone marker placed there by Dr. Whitehawk and the local Shoshone community. The inscription reads, "He learned to listen, but only after the streams fell silent. Visitors often find fresh offerings there. Eagle feathers, small bundles of sage, sometimes flowers from people who've never heard of Wilkins but sense the weight of history in that quiet place." The cabin foundation is still visible, covered now by aspens that have grown up through the old floorboards, and if you know what to look for, you can still see beaver sign returning to the nearby creek. Not the massive colonies that once defined this landscape, but small, cautious communities of animals whose ancestors survived the great collapse of the 1830s. They're building their dams with the same patient precision their species has employed for millions of years, creating small pockets of abundance in a world still learning to balance innovation with wisdom. The floating trap remains a perfect metaphor for the double-edged nature of human ingenuity. Every solution creates new problems. Every innovation carries unintended consequences, and every generation must choose whether to build on wisdom or repeat old mistakes with new tools. In the end, Jedediah Wilkins' legacy isn't the revolutionary trap design that changed the fur trade, but the hard-earned understanding that true innovation must float on more than just clever engineering. It must rest on the deeper currents of ecological wisdom and respect for the natural world that sustains us all.